Liberalism, section. Liberal socialism and radicalism. Much more so than Bentham, it was Kant who came close to radicalism. His clear adoption of a position favorable to revolutionary France is not so significant. More relevant is the fact that, intervening in 1795, a year after the abolition of slavery in the French colonies, with clear critical reference to England, Perpetual Peace identified, quote, the Sugar-Cane Islands as the site of the cruelest slavery that has ever been imagined, end quote. There were two further decisive elements. Like the French radicals, we must not forget that the colonial question weighed even less heavily on Germany than France. Kant problematized the boundaries between civilization and barbarism. It was England that now represented the cause of, quote, slavery and barbarism. Finally, quite unlike the liberals, he did not confine himself to criticizing Pitt, whom he said was rightly, quote, hated as an enemy of the human race. The German philosopher's radicalism did not escape his contemporaries. While Goethe regarded his attitude towards England as scarcely, quote, liberal, Wilhelm von Humboldt sharply distanced himself from the, quote, democratism pervading in Perpetual Peace. In England, rather than Bentham, it was John Stuart Mill who approximated to radicalism, when he identified slavery as, quote, the most flagrant of all possible violations of liberal principles, and demanded those who defended it, quote, the powers of evil, end quote. In his autobiography, along with, quote, the noble body of abolitionists, Mill also celebrated John Brown, author of the failed attempt to get the slaves of the southern United States to rise up. In a text of 1824, the English philosopher expressed his sympathy for the cause of the blacks of San Domingo, Haiti, whom the Napoleonic expedition vainly sought half to exterminate and half to reduce to the conditions of slavery once again. Putting clear distance between himself and the overwhelming majority of his contemporaries, Mill did not seem to recoil in horror from the prospect of a revolution from below by black slaves. And yet, in another respect, he was the theorist of a new, quote, slavery, temporary and pedagogical in kind for savages, end quote. See Chapter 7. The English author asserted that the final stage of his development was characterized by gravitation towards, quote, socialism, and at the same time renewed distrust of, quote, democracy. What caused and justified the latter was, quote, the ignorance and especially the selfishness and brutality of the mass, end quote. Already problematic in the metropolis, democracy proved decidedly dangerous and inadvisable when it came to the colonies and peoples of colonial origin, including Afro-Americans. Theorists of the planetary despotism of the West, Mill seems equally remote from radical, quote, abolitionist democracy. Hence, radicalism and socialism must not be confused. Socialist aspirations can readily be combined with colonialism. Followers of Fourier and Saint-Simon envisaged building communities of a more or less socialist type on land taken from Arabs in Algeria. Like, quote, democracy, quote, socialism can be envisaged restrictively for the master race, and at the expense of colonial peoples or peoples of colonial origin. At certain points in his evolution towards liberal socialism, Mill approached the threshold, separating it from radicalism, but without crossing it. With reference to Zionism, Arendt drew attention to the presence within it of what at first sight is a peculiar tendency. It was characterized, on the one hand, by support for, quote, chauvinist objectives, and on the other, by commitment to pursuing collectivist experiments and a, quote, rigorous realization of social justice within its own community. Thus crystallized, quote, a most paradoxical conglomerate of radical approach and revolutionary social reforms domestically, with outmoded and outright reactionary political lines within the field of foreign policy, and in the field of relations with colonial peoples. In other words, quote, master race democracy can also go further and take the form of, quote, master race socialism, whereas what defines radicalism is precisely the argument against any claim by a particular ethnic or social group to pose as a, quote, master race. When in 1860, during the Second Opium War, a Franco-British expedition destroyed the Summer Palace, it was Victor Hugo who proved to be the inheritor of radicalism, with his denunciation of the barbarity committed by self-styled civilizers. While for Mill, as for the liberal culture of the time, there continued to be few doubts about the complete identity between the West and civilization. End of section and end of chapter.